power could shape the world. The Vietnam War proved otherwise. For nearly 2 decades, a small Southeast Asian nation stood against the most powerful army on earth and changed the course of history. This is the story of how it happened. After World War II, the world was divided by a new battle. The Cold War. The United States and the Soviet Union were fighting not with armies on open fields, but through influence, politics, and proxy wars. Vietnam, a country that had just fought for independence from France, suddenly became part of this global struggle. In 1954, after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, the Geneva Accords temporarily divided Vietnam into 2 zones. In the north, you had Chi Minh's communist government. In the south, a government supported by the United States. To American leaders, Vietnam wasn't just some faraway country. It was a domino. They had this idea called the domino theory. They feared that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia might follow. One country after another. This fear, this one idea, would come to shape everything that happened next. At first, America's involvement was small. They sent advisors, money, and equipment to prop up the government in South Vietnam. But the South was unstable. Governments rose and fell in a series of coups. Corruption was rampant. The United States felt that, without a stronger intervention, South Vietnam was going to collapse. Then, in August 1964, something happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. American ships reported being attacked by North Vietnamese patrol boats. To this day, historians still debate what really happened out there in the dark. But the event became the justification for a massive U.S. escalation. Within months, tens of thousands of American troops were on Vietnamese soil. A few years later, that number ballooned to more than 500,000. America was confident. It believed its overwhelming technology and firepower would bring a quick and decisive victory. But Vietnam was not that kind of battlefield. Vietnam was unlike any war the US had ever fought before. First, there was the terrain. Thick jungles, steep mountains, suffocating heat, and monsoon rains that turned everything to mud. Soldiers often couldn't see the enemy, but the enemy could always see them. Then there were the tunnels. Underground networks, like the famous Chi tunnels near Saigon, stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Entire bases, hospitals, and command centers existed right under the feet of American soldiers. As one GI famously said, "You weren't fighting an army. You were fighting ghosts." The tactics were completely different. 2. This was guerrilla warfare. Hit-and-run ambushes, booby traps, made of bamboo and sharpened stakes, hidden under leaves. Enemy fighters who looked just like regular farmers, blending seamlessly into the local population. In response, the US unleashed its industrial might. It dropped more bombs on Vietnam, a country about the size of New Mexico, than on Germany and Japan combined during all of World War II. But the fighting only grew more intense. For the Vietnamese, this was not just another proxy war. It was a total struggle for independence and the reunification of their country. In early 1968, during the Vietnamese Lunar New Year, called Tet, something happened that shocked the world. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces launched a massive, coordinated attack on more than 100 cities and military bases all across South Vietnam. They even attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon, the very symbol of American power. Militarily, the U.S. and South Vietnamese forces eventually pushed back the offensive, inflicting heavy casualties on their attackers. But psychologically and politically, the impact was catastrophic. Back in America, people watching the news felt betrayed. For years, they had been told by their leaders that the war was almost won, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. The Tet Offensive proved that was not true. It showed the enemy was far from defeated. Suddenly, public support for the war in the United States began to collapse. Anti-war protests, which had been simmering for years, exploded across university campuses, city streets, and even within the government itself. For the first time, a majority of Americans started asking a fundamental question: what are we really doing in Vietnam? By the early 1970s, the U.S. government knew it could not continue the war at the same scale. President Richard Nixon announced a new policy called Vietnamization. The idea was to shift the responsibility for combat to South Vietnamese forces while gradually withdrawing American troops. At the same time, peace talks began in Paris to put pressure on North Vietnam. During the negotiations, the U.S. escalated its bombing campaigns to their most intense levels of the entire war. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The agreement called for a ceasefire and the complete withdrawal of American forces. The last U.S. combat troops left Vietnam that same year. An era was over. But for the Vietnamese, the war was not. The fight between North and South Vietnam continued, now without direct American involvement. Without the massive support of the United States, South Vietnam struggled to survive. In early 1975, North Vietnamese forces launched a final, massive campaign, known as the Ho Chi Minh Campaign. City after city in the South fell with shocking speed. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. Iconic images of helicopters desperately evacuating people from rooftops were broadcast around the world. The Vietnam War, one of the longest and most divisive conflicts of the 20th century, had finally come to an end. Vietnam was, at last, reunified under one government. The cost of this war was almost beyond comprehension. Millions of Vietnamese soldiers and civilians lost their lives. More than 58,000 American servicemen were killed. Entire regions of Vietnam were destroyed by bombs and chemical defoliants like Agent Orange, the devastating effects of which continue to impact generations today. Communities on both sides were torn apart. For the United States, the war reshaped its foreign policy, its military strategy, and shattered the public's trust in its government. For Vietnam, it marked both unimaginable loss and the long-awaited, hard-won reunification of the country. The Vietnam War wasn't a story of who had the most soldiers or the strongest weapons. It was a story of determination, belief, and the immense human cost of conflict. In the end, the story of this war reminds us that true strength is not found in weapons or firepower, but in the will to believe and the longing for peace within human beings. War may level cities and take countless lives, but it can never extinguish the spirit of those who yearn for freedom. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. See you in the stories to come.